Meine Damen und Herren, liebe Freunde des Museums, lieber Elshan, lieber Michael Church, Shop Becher, good evening, guten Abend. Ich freue mich, dass Sie hier sind. Ich bin der Direktor vom Museum für Islamische Kunst nebenan im Pergamon-Museum und eigentlich sollten wir auch dort in der James-Simon-Galerie heute Abend Elshan zuhören. Leider gab es einen Havariefall und so sind wir hier im Bode-Museum. Und ich danke dem Bode-Museum, dass wir wirklich in diesen Räumlichkeiten sein können. Und natürlich danke ich all denen, die da auch mitgeholfen haben, das hier stattfinden zu lassen. Dem Hauptstadtkulturfonds, den Freunden des Museums für Islamische Kunst. Übrigens, da ist Musik drin, wenn Sie so einen Flyer mitnehmen wollen, super Flyer. Wir machen viel Programme und Iran ist für uns was ganz Besonderes. Und normalerweise, Iran, heute denkt man natürlich sofort an die Nachricht, man hört im Ohr. Zan, Zendegi, Ozadi. Frau, Freiheit, also Leben und Freiheit. Und kann eine Musikveranstaltung heute zur iranischen Kunst, zur Iran politikfrei sein? Schwierig. Ich komme darauf zurück, denn eigentlich hatten wir gar nicht vor, über Politik zu sprechen, als wir vor 2 Jahren Elshan Ghasimi kennengelernt haben, im Rahmen einer Iran-Ausstellung. Und wir waren so begeistert von dieser Künstlerin, dass wir gerne mit ihr zusammenarbeiten wollten. Haben zuerst einen Film gemacht in der Ausstellung. Wenn man auf YouTube schaut, also wenn Sie nach Hause kommen und nichts zu tun haben, auf YouTube ist fast eine Stunde, Dreiviertelstunde ein Film über die Ausstellung mit ihr, wie sie zwischen den Objekten und vor den Objekten wirklich den Raum füllt mit wunderbarer Musik und haben dann auch einen digitalen Raum geschaffen in unserem neuen Bildungsportal Islamic Art, wo auch sie wieder spielt. Und als sie dann sagte, können wir nicht mal das, was ich eigentlich gut kann, nämlich Dinge neu erfinden, neue Systeme in der Musik zu entwickeln, das auch aufführen, waren wir natürlich begeistert und gesagt, das machen wir. Inzwischen ist die Lage im Iran schwieriger geworden und auch ihr Leben ist so ein bisschen damit verbunden. Erst natürlich als Künstlerin im Iran, schon mit 9 Jahren hat sie angefangen, die Ausbildung zu machen. Mit 17 war sie die jüngste Mitarbeiterin oder Angestellte im iranischen Nationalorchester, ging dann nach Baku und lernte dann auch die aserbaidschanisch-iranische Musik noch weiter zu vertiefen, ist also in mehreren Ländern zu Hause, so auch ab seit 2006 in Deutschland, wo sie weiter sich mit ihrer Musik beschäftigt und unterrichtet und etwas macht, was dann wieder doch politisch ist, nämlich dieser Move nach Deutschland hat auch was damit zu tun, dass ein Land, das 1979 eine Revolution durchgeführt hat, es nicht geschafft hat, in diesen Jahrzehnten, die Islamische Republik Iran ist älter als die DDR geworden ist, in diesen Jahrzehnten Frauen Perspektiven zu geben, sich so zu entwickeln, wie es sein soll. Und der Braindraft aus dem Iran ist enorm hoch. Man hat praktisch die Hälfte der Bevölkerung vor Gericht, die Hälfte der Stimme gegeben, in Erbschaften, in der politischen System und so weiter. Aber auch in der Musik, wenn man, was Michael nachher erzählen wird, über die Musik, über die Systeme der Musik guckt, wer hat die Radīf systematisiert, wer hat sie gespielt, wer sind die Meister, sind das alles Männer. Die überschreiben, sind alles Männer. Die Wissen wird im Iran sehr stark patriarchalisch weitergeführt. Auch in anderen Kunstformen, in der Kalligraphie, in vielen Dingen ist Wissenszugang zu Ressourcen durch Strukturen des Patriarchalismus gesetzt. Und auch viele Bücher, die über den Iran geschrieben worden sind, die reden dann halt über Schia und so weiter und Heilserwartung. Das beste Buch, was ich je gelesen habe, hieß Die iranische Revolution Iran als patriarchalische Protestbewegung. Im Vergleich dann zu anderen patriarchalischen Protestbewegungen, die es ja auch weltweit gibt und heute ja auch wieder stärker werden in einigen Ländern. Daher ist das, was Elshan tut, nicht nur ein Ausbrechen aus ihrer Heimat, sondern Ausbrechen aus den Traditionen, eine Stille. Nein, Stille ist ja nicht eine musikalische Revolution, indem sie neue Systeme entwickelt, in einer Art und Weise, wie sie es wahrscheinlich im Iran nie geschafft hätte. Und deswegen sind wir sehr froh, dass wir sie hier haben, dass sie für uns spielt, dass Michael Church uns das sofort noch ein bisschen näher bringt von der Geschichte. Und ich glaube, ich habe allen gedankt, den Freunden, den Hauptstadtkulturfonds, dem Bode-Museum, unseren Leuten. So kann ich nur noch sagen, San, Zendegi, Ozadi gleich Ghasimi. Wir freuen uns sehr.
Well, good evening, everybody. Guten Tag, guten Abend. I'm apologizing, I'm not just speaking in German. I could once speak reasonable German, but I've lost it, unfortunately. So your English, I'm sure, is better than mine anyway, so I think it's fine. Now, I'm here to introduce the great Iranian musician, Elshan Ghasimi, and I'm very honored to be asked to do it. I've also been asked to talk about the different forms which classical music can take around the world, because our European form is one of many. I'm also going to talk about folk music because, and why its survival is important, because folk music is the foundation of classical music. That's not often realized, but it's actually the case. Without its roots in folk music, classical music can die. And as I hope to argue this evening, classical climate change happens in music too. First, I must explain why I became a musicologist. When I was 20, I accidentally began a love affair with non-Western music. It was when I heard the young Ravi Shankar make his London debut. It was when I heard I loved Beethoven, I loved the Beatles, I loved jazz, but his music blew me away. It was incredible. That was a key moment in my life. And the next key moment happened a few years later in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. I wandered by chance, in the street, into a music lesson where a group of young children were being taught to sing a Georgian song. It was in 3 parts and harmonically very, very complex, very difficult, with lots of dissonances. And their teacher let me listen, and I watched with astonishment as, in the space of just 1 hour, these children learned not only their own parts, but also the other 2 parts as well. And these kids were only 10, or less than 10. So how did this complicated music work? And what were its rules? I decided to find out. And my research took me to unexpected places. First of all, to a hill outside Tbilisi, where I found a group of very sad young men, tears in their eyes, and they were singing a slow polyphonic lament. They had bottles of vodka, and they were mourning a friend who had just died in a car crash. And they asked if I'd like to join them for a drink, and I said of course I would. So, oiled by alcohol, the musical lament went on. That was on a Sunday, and I walked down to the cathedral in Tbilisi, past something else I never expected to see. Street vendors of newspapers were selling, if you believe it, they were selling Beethoven sonatas in sheet music. You'd never ever see that anywhere else. That was a totally extraordinary thing. And in the streets round the cathedral, there were more surprises. I saw little circles of middle-aged men singing hymns in immaculate 3-part harmony, just like the children, just like the young men on the hill. Inside the cathedral, there were 3 choirs, 1 male, 1 female, and 1 mixed, and they were taking it in turns to generate a non-stop stream of that same 3-part harmony. All this was 30 years ago, before capitalism had discovered Tbilisi, and when it was still, in effect, a Soviet city. In those days, every Georgian adult could join in complex 3-part drinking songs with an accuracy which no amount of alcohol could destroy, because the music was hardwired into their DNA. In this society, the distinction between amateur and professional singers didn't exist. Neither was there any distinction between Georgian folk music and Georgian classical music. It was all one thing. In Georgia, it's simply known as traditional music, and it's performed by everybody. Today's young Georgians listen to the same pop music as millennials do everywhere else, but you can still find that amazing polyphonic facility in all Georgians who are over 50. Now, back to my story. I got a job as a globe-trotting sound recordist for the BBC, and that work led to further love affairs with other musical traditions. But while recording in Africa and Asia, I was working also as a classical music critic, and in that business I was a lone voice. My fellow critics regarded my obsession with music from other cultures as very strange, as totally eccentric. As one of them put it, after I tried to explain why Japanese gagaku was so fascinating, he said, "But it's only folk music. You can't compare it with our classical music." In fact, gagaku is the ancient and highly refined classical music of Japan. What my colleague was expressing was the musical equivalent of political colonialism, and I wanted to destroy that colonialism. So I gathered together some of the world's leading ethnomusicologists, and we produced a book to celebrate the classical music of other cultures. Its title is The Other Classical Musics, and the most significant thing about it is that the European tradition, the music of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, is there, but simply as one of 15 traditions. Competition between European and non-European music could for once take place on a level playing field, without the usual bias towards Europe. And that book allowed some discoveries, one of which was that when different musics were compared, side by side, something became apparent. Local styles from countries geographically far apart could be strikingly similar. Now, should I have been surprised by this? Not really, because many of these classical musics have a shared ancestry, a shared origin. Now, European classical music and the music of the Muslim Middle East, they both have a common root in classical Greek theory, which itself derived from ancient Babylon. Babylonian music theory was translated into Arabic and became the underpinning for the Arabic science of music, and that science laid down rules for the structure of scales and the mathematical tuning of intervals, and these persisted to this day all over the Middle East. But versions of those scales were also absorbed by the medieval Christian Church. In other words, the musics of medieval Christian Europe and the musics of the Muslim Middle East have a common origin. This is generally not realized, but it's a very profound truth, I think. In our different classical styles, we're all actually brothers and sisters in the same family. Now, let's look at some unifying factors in Middle Eastern classical music. Factors which are shared along a line stretching eastwards from Morocco via Algeria, Egypt, Turkey, Iraq, Azerbaijan, and Iran, going as far as Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Xinjiang in China. Each of these nations has its own classical tradition and its own system of theory. All weave their vocal and instrumental pieces into suites, a suite being a sequence of pieces, some slow and some fast. And they all deploy a richly ornamented melodic style, very, very melismatic, with lots of sort of ornamentation. And something separates all these classical traditions from the European tradition, and this is that the European tradition is based on fixed compositions, which are written down, but Middle Eastern classical musics are all based on improvisation, all of them, and they're not written down. That is a very profound difference, leading to a very profound separation between forms of music and what you're going to hear from Elshan a little bit later. Now, then there's the modal principle, which you find everywhere in the Middle East. And a mode is a scale, which in the Middle East is different from the European scale. It implies not an even flow of notes, but it implies a melodic pattern in which some notes have more importance than others. And in Middle Eastern modal music, which is known as makam, each mode has its own sound world and its own mood and its own set of social connotations. The most extreme example of this system is the Persian Radīf, which we'll come to in a few minutes. Finally, all classical traditions have a religious dimension. Think of the Zen Buddhist instruction, in one sound become the Buddha. Think of the Persian poet Rumi's lovely image of the flute being cut from the reed bed. As he put it, listen to the reed flute, how bitterly it complains, and how it tells of separation's pains. This is a very poetic image, and it suggests a desire for union with God. And it's an idea which is something which has underpinned all the poetry set to music in Central Asia and also Persia or Iran. Now, I find it very romantic to think that Makam, we enter the world of the spirit. Now, one conviction which all the writers in my book passionately shared was the fear that these musical traditions can die and become mummified museum exhibits. And this fear is not new. 2 centuries ago, the German song collector Ludolf Parisius, if you've heard of him, he wrote, "Whoever wants to collect songs from the mouth of the people should hurry, because folk songs are disappearing one after another." 80 years ago, Bela Bartok wrote, "One day all folk music will have been swept away." This mattered greatly to him because all Bartok's own classical compositions were based on folk music. Well, Bartok was wrong. Folk music has not been swept away. But in another sense, he was also right. He was right about the musical effects of westernization, industrialization, and urbanization. If you think about all those things, they're all inimical to any kind of folk music. He was right about the death of local music, which always follows the death of villages. Look at the songs which the American Alan Lomax collected in the 50s in Spain, Portugal, and Italy. A great many of those were work songs for manual trades. But all those trades have now been industrialized. And if you take away the manual activity, you take away the meaning of the song and its purpose. In effect, you kill it. Very few of the songs which Alan Lomax collected are sung today. They're gone because the reasons for their existence are gone. There's no need for them and there's no relevance in them. Now, I've talked about the centrality of religion in traditional music, but even religion can be its enemy. One colleague who works in Africa tells me that some American evangelists forbid their Christian converts to sing their African ritual songs. They are supposed to be the work of the devil, and they're not allowed to sing them. And the deadliest enemy, of course, of traditional music is war. Look at the Taliban in Afghanistan and the Islamic fundamentalists in Mali. War kills music. Now, we shouldn't give in to pessimism, and even UNESCO is beginning to support disappearing musics. But the fact remains, much of the world may be approaching what could be described as traditional music's end of history. Outdated forms of music may not be replaced by new ones because the conditions required to do so may no longer exist and may never exist again. Since the dawn of time, since recorded history began, communities have created their own music. But we now have to ask, are they now losing that power? If they are, no loss may be immediately apparent. We won't feel different in any way. But there may be a gradual realization that there's a barely sensed but mysteriously significant musical substratum, sort of underlying element, underlying continuity, has gone, leaving an ache like the ache from a phantom limb. You lose an arm or a leg, but you still feel pain where the arm or the leg used to be. I believe that traditional musics are now being eroded by their own equivalent of global warming, their own inexorable form of climate change. And all this is why we should treasure the traditional musics we still have. And it's why Persian classical music, which we'll hear in a few minutes' time, is so important. By the way, it's called Persian classical music, not Iranian classical music. Now to Iran. Persian musicians have never had an easy time. There have been periods when their kings encouraged musical performances and periods when music was strictly forbidden, because the Quran is ambiguous about music. There are lines in it which support music, and there are lines which condemn it. As a result, the history of music in Iran has been like a seesaw, sometimes up, sometimes down. The 1978 revolution sent it very far down, with all music in public spaces being banned. More recently, there's been a relaxation in official attitudes, but solo female singing in public is still prohibited. Women are still forbidden to sing for audiences of men. Yet at present, Persian classical music is enjoying a renaissance, and this is thanks to the leadership of its musicians and to the devotion of its audiences. Those audiences are often small. It's traditionally performed in private gatherings for small circles of connoisseurs or in Sufi brotherhoods. Or it's just for family and friends. It's a very intimate art. And that intimacy is why this music is so finely calibrated. and why the same basic form, orally transmitted, hasn't changed for centuries. The form is known as the Radīf, a kind of suite which acts as a framework for composition and improvisation, and it's bound by a labyrinth of rules which can take a lifetime to understand. Once, a year or two ago, Elshan tried to explain them to me and I was completely lost. Anyway, we're very honored to have you here this evening, Elshan, and you're going to do something which is, in a subtle way, revolutionary. Elshan's called her performance tonight the reinterpretation of the Radīf. But why does the Radīf need reinterpreting? What's wrong with it now? Her reply to me was that the Radīf, in the Radīf, she's always found there's something missing, something incomplete. She worked every day on it, but somehow it never felt right to her. It needed, she said, a new dimension. Did that mean new melodies? I asked. No, she said, nothing so simple and obvious, and nothing technical. So what was the problem? She replied it had to do with the soul of the music, the spirit. I was puzzled, and she admitted that she'd been puzzled too, until one day her husband Julian asked her a question. He asked what documented version of the Radīf had been recorded by a woman. And Elshan realized that there wasn't one. No woman had ever recorded it. The three main documented versions of the Radīf were all made by famous male musicians. Elshan decided, therefore, that there must be a female version because it would be completely different, and she has created one. And that's what we're going to hear tonight. While her sisters in Iran are demonstrating its male domination in the streets in Tehran and other Iranian cities, Elshan is making a female assault on the male-dominated Radīf. But why does the sex of the player matter so much? Would it change the melody? For me, said Elshan, it would be completely different, though I couldn't put the difference into words. The difference would be in the soul of the music. I then asked her a different question. If she was listening to a man who was playing the piano behind a screen, and then a woman, both playing the same piece by Chopin, would she know who was playing without seeing them? And her reply was this. She said, I can't explain why, and I can't put it into words, but I would know which was the man and which was the woman. So my advice to you all this evening is this. When Elshan starts playing, don't think about technicalities. Just let her tar, her lovely speaking instrument, speak to you. And listen also to her silences, as well as her sounds, because silence in the Radīf is something new. So catch the female spirit. Thank you.